For watercolor, you're going to need a rag, possibly some tape, a watercolor brush, which is fluffy and soft, a pan of watercolors or maybe some liquid watercolors, and a chambered palette with a pipette instead. You're also going to need some water. I like 2 cups, one to clean my brush and one to add water. Some watercolorists will have you tape your paper to a board to help prevent buckling. Although in this classroom we usually just work on top of a newspaper because our papers tend to warp anyway. Watercolor is water soluble, meaning that it will kind of break down in water, which means that you can use a wet rag to clean non-porous surfaces. This doesn't always work when you're trying to clean absorbent surfaces such as the paper. Sometimes you can get a little bit of paint to come off of your surface, but it might break the paper. Watercolor is also translucent, meaning it's kind of see-through. This blue and red watercolor paint is already dry, so it's not going to bleed when I layer the orange on top. However, because of its translucency, you can still see it underneath. To paint with watercolor, you just mix water with your watercolor paint and then apply it to the surface of the paper. The colors will get lighter the more water you add. Add clean water and not rinse water to keep your colors clear. This watercolor is still wet, so if I put another color right next to this color, they're going to bleed together. If I pick up my paper and move it, my colors will also start to drip back and forth. I'm going to paint a little orange fruit here, starting with a darker value, rinsing my brush, and then just using my brush to pull the lighter values out to the other side. I add more paint to areas of darkness, and I try to take some paint away from light areas. I use a heat gun to dry out my paint so I can add more layers, being careful not to splatter puddles of paint across my page. I then add a blue to make the shadow areas of my orange darker, and I keep going back and forth between adding different layers of color and taking some away to build up my shadows. This requires repeated sessions with the heat gun in order to prevent my colors from bleeding. I regularly rinse and dab my paintbrush onto my rag in order to prevent large puddles of paint from forming on my page. When I'm finished with this orange, I'm going to show you how to use liquid watercolors, which are highly concentrated and need to be mixed with water. This whole little cup is filled with water. I'm going to put just 1 drop of liquid watercolor in it. Look how much the color changes. With liquid watercolor, you're going to need a chambered palette liquid watercolor, a pipette, and perhaps some of these already pre-mixed liquid watercolors. We already know that when we add more water to watercolors, they get lighter. My first chamber is going to have 10 drops of water, my second will have 5, and my last one will have 1. Then I'm only going to add 1 drop of liquid watercolor to each of these chambers, and we'll see how the values change. I need to make sure to rinse my pipette in my rinse jar and not my clean water jar. The chamber with the 10:1 ratio is going to give me a lighter value. I could even add more water to that to lighten it up. My 5:1 chamber looks pretty similar to my 1:1 chamber, so I'm going to add just a line of pure pigment here. This helps us get a sense of how the water ratio changes the values. To clean the pipette, I start with the rinse water, I then use the clean water, and I use the rag to clean the outside of the pipette as well.